This is the Totnes Hemp show. We've been away for a few weeks, but we're back now with our first ever female guest, Annie Machon. Hi, Annie.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm good. And yourself?
Not too bad. Full of mischief.
You're in Düsseldorf at the moment, yeah?
I'm here at the moment, yeah, but I spend half my life on the road these days, sort of travelling and doing talks and speaking at conferences and things. So it's pretty tiring, but it's fun.
Yeah, because we've known each other since 2005, when you came down to do a talk in Totnes in December 2005. So that's quite a long time.
It is a long time, yeah. It's nice to stay in contact.
Yeah, no, absolutely great. And of course, you were talking about different things back then, but we don't really want to go over that again, do we? You're doing new
Well,
stuff
I
now.
don't know. I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about today, I mean, we'll be talking about sort of LEAP and the drug wars and everything, but I see quite an overlap between the way that the pretext of the war on drugs is misused for all sorts of purposes by our government, just as the war on terror is. So, you know, I think it's very linked, very meshed. So it's sort of quite.
Well, like myself, in the last year or so, I've become more involved in drug reform activism. So I guess we've both found a similar path. Now, can you tell us a bit about LEAP?
Yeah, LEAP stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And this is a campaign that was set up 10 years ago in the United States by 5 former police officers who had some experience working on the front line undercover against narcotics targets. And they come to the conclusion that the war on drugs was failing. It was failing on a number of levels, both the macro and the micro. And they came together initially because they were concerned about the effect the war on drugs was having on their local communities, on people they knew, on the breakdown of trust between the police and the police. But since then, in the last decade, this organisation has grown exponentially around the world. It now has representatives and supporters in 119 countries. It's got almost 90,000 supporters, and it's got thousands of speakers, people who are former police officers and prison governors and judges and lawyers and drug czars, you name it, and all people with their professional expertise who are critiquing the war on drugs, which is precisely the law that they were actually asked to uphold when they were in the police. So it's quite an unusual activist group because you don't really expect a bunch of police officers or lawyers or judges to come out and say, actually the war on drugs is failed, prohibition is failing the people of the planet. But that's precisely what they're doing, and they're getting a lot of traction internationally. Now it started as a US campaign, but I'm now involved in this. I've been a speaker for LEAP for 3 years, and earlier this year I became the director for LEAP Europe. So we're in the process of setting up a sort of Europe-wide LEAP. And also individual countries are now setting up their own LEAP groups, and they will be launched in the UK in November. We're hoping in the House of Parliament.
So 90,000 members. That's quite a lot.
Getting on for, yeah, or supporters, yes. It's an awful lot of people, and as I said, from 119 countries worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, often we focus on the impact of the drug wars and drug usage in the Western countries, like the US, particularly in the UK. But what people tend to forget is the impact around the world. I mean, they're, you know, across the Middle East, many of the drug-producing countries, across Africa now, which has become one of the major routes for drug importation into Europe. And this has meant that whole countries have collapsed into narco states over a period of a few years. And of course in Latin America and Mexico, where the drug violence and American interference in the war on drugs has caused so much suffering, so much death over the last decade. So, you know, this has global impact, and the voice of LEAP seems to have a global impact as well, and I'm glad that we can make a contribution to this using our former expertise.
Now, we started this interview yesterday, but we were having technical problems. But it seemed to
I always have problems using the internet.
When the sound was going, it was the problem this end. I fixed it, obviously. Hope, touch wood. And I remember at the point when we said, "Oh, forget it. Let's try and do this tomorrow." You were talking about Mexico. So could you go over what because that was really interesting. Could you say that again, what we were talking about yesterday?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, the impact of the war on drugs, which of course flows from the impact of the US hegemony over the UN and statutes that make drugs illegal, that install prohibition. The US has been fighting a covert war in Mexico for decades now, trying to stop the drug cartels importing not only cannabis, but a whole range of different drugs, including methamphetamine now, is the big one that they're taking into the US. And of course, the border between the US and Mexico is incredibly porous. It is the US's backyard. So 6 years ago, they decided to ramp up the war on drugs in Mexico, and this meant supplying military materiel, personnel, all sorts of aid to the Mexican government to try and crack down on these cartels. And what we've seen over the last 6 years has been over 62,000 deaths in Mexico of innocent bystanders, not people involved in the drug trade, but innocent bystanders have been murdered on the streets of Mexico because of the US obsession with drugs and stopping people smoking weed in the US. And this has gone largely unreported in the US. So over the summer, there were a large number of activists who went across the US from Mexico, headed up by people who've lost family members in the crossfire, and they toured across the US, stopping about, I think, 40 different cities, doing talks and media and all that sort of thing. And they called it the Mexican Caravan Heat. They were saying they don't necessarily agree with drug usage, but the fallout and the damage caused to their community in Mexico has just been immense in the last 6 years alone. So they're calling for a rethink about the war on drugs and the damage done to other countries outside the US. I'm very, very involved with that.
Is it falling on deaf ears, or are you getting anywhere?
No, I mean, certainly the response during Caravan was amazingly positive from all communities, and also they got media coverage. But of course, we all know, anyone who's been involved in any sort of activism knows that you can get a lot of media coverage and a lot of interest and help from local communities. But the blockage is the politicians.
Yeah.
The only change you can ever get to these stupid prohibition drug laws are going to come from the politicians. First of all, from the UN, which is where the sort of fountainhead of drug prohibition comes from. And of course, if statutes can be changed some way, then from the individual national governments of countries, who will then say, I'm sorry, this isn't working, it's harming our country, it's harming the communities of our country, and it's harming the economy of our country as well.
It's very expensive. I mean, how many people in America are in for drugs offences?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact number of people in there.
They have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, don't they? And a lot of those, most of those are for drug offences.
I think it's about 4 million inmates, and over half of them are for drug possession, not even higher up the food chain, violent crime or anything. The US has currently 25% of the world's prisoners in its prisons, and it only has 2% of the world's population. But also it's divided along racial lines, because I think it's only about 13% of the US come from ethnic minorities, and yet they are far more likely to end up in prisons than the white drug users are in the US. So this has become a huge sort of tectonic clash in the US, because again it's seen that the drug laws are applied along the racial lines. And it's not too much to overstate the fact, I don't think, and a lot of the campaigners in the US now saying that it's become another racial issue, that realizing the black community in America because of the drug war, which is a sort of covert attack on the civil liberties of the black community in America.
Didn't Mexico try to ease their laws, but then back down because of the American government put pressure on them not to?
Indeed, the whole ramping up the drug war started again 6 years ago. But it has to be said that the whole of Latin America has traditionally been perceived as America's backyard, and America has interfered over the years in politics, economics, the whole arena of public life in Latin America. But over the last few years, of course, we've seen a massive pushback on that front, and a resurgence of pride and economic confidence across that continent. So, with slightly more left-wing governments in a whole number of countries, in Uruguay, Brazil, in Venezuela, of course, Hugo Chavez.
Well, Uruguay has, I think yesterday, has become the first country where officially government is banning marijuana.
Yes, so all these countries now have a rethink, and they're seeing the damage that's been done by this covert war on drugs waged by US proxy, and they're saying enough is enough. And I think it's a sort of sense of regrowing confidence down there. Their economy is back on their feet. They have governments have more represented their people, and they're just saying, well, the drug war is causing more harm to us than good. It's not helping the people within our own countries who have drug tendencies as well. But the violence, associated with the escalation of the drug wars is actively harming us, and we're not going to do it anymore. So Uruguay is great in the sense that they're saying we need to have a rethink. It's not working. It hasn't worked. The drug prohibition hasn't worked for 4 decades. That's a rethink. And if that means legalization or even legalization, then we need to have an adult conversation about this, not just head in populist media.
Absolutely. Now, as you know, I can be a bit of a conspiracy theorist. Even yourself, have been known to touch in that arena. But there's a lot of truth in these conspiracies. And I've read. Have you read Gary Webb's book, Dark Alliance?
I haven't. No.
This is detailing how the CIA were basically responsible for the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and that they were facilitating very much the importation of cocaine from South America to the USA.
Yes, I have heard of that book. I've heard of that theory, certainly. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I will look at facts, and just because something does indicate a conspiracy, it doesn't mean it's mad. Conspiracies go on all the time, and we saw that with the Iraq-Contra conspiracy in the 1980s that lay there. But we're also seeing as well a drug growth around the world, where terrorist groups start to get most of their funding from the drug trade as well. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan and some of the other countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot of Afghani around here at the moment, which is obviously a good thing, but I wonder how that's coming into the country.
Well, indeed. I mean, there are issues, of course, that a blind eye can be turned. It's very, very difficult for UK enforcement to pick up on contraband goods, be it weapons, be it drugs, be it people coming into the country. And, I remember from my time in MI5 back in the 90s when I was working very closely with customs looking at the movement of arms, they would say that it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Now, of course, the UK is an island, and it's slightly easier to perhaps protect its borders, theoretically.
Yeah.
But to get a situation like the US with a huge border along with Mexico, then it's impossible. It's incredibly porous. And of course we're not going to stop the flow of drugs. And all this money goes into organised crime, and it goes into funding terrorist organisations, and who knows what beyond.
Yeah, and you can fit a lot of drugs in one lorry or one boat, so I guess it's not that hard to get it into the UK.
Well, indeed, or actually you could fit it into a submarine. I mean, I think some of the Latin American, Central American countries with the drug cartels, they have enough money and enough clout to actually go around and design their own submarines and build their own submarines to get the drugs into the US. So we're talking about whole narco states, a narco economy.
A Dutch friend of mine bought a speedboat for someone in Morocco. Sold it for a profit, obviously, but apparently if you buy a speedboat in Morocco or Spain, it has to be registered with the authorities. So don't know what they wanted a speedboat there for. Who knows?
Who could guess?
You mentioned Afghanistan. We talked about that a bit yesterday in the short conversation we had. You were saying about the opium production there.
Yes, because of course the war in Afghanistan over the last decade has cost in excess of $6 billion so far. And one of the things they always trumpet is not only they're trying to bring democracy and women's rights to Afghanistan, in which they've egregiously failed, we've also seen that the acreage under cultivation for opium production has doubled in that time. So again, the war on drugs has not just stopped the flow of drugs, it's actually helped the increase of production of drugs. It's just a failure across the planet.
So, I see occasionally there's a few chief constables in the UK, I know, and some former judges who have spoken out. What high-profile figures are there arguing for change?
Well, this is an argument that is shifting, and it's shifted very obviously over the last couple of years with the Global Drug Policy Commission. So a lot of celebrities are now speaking out and saying that this is just not working, it's causing more harm than good. In LEAP, we do have 3 other former chief constables who are official LEAP speakers. And also we have a fraud and organised crime specialist from the Met, Rowan Bolsworth-Davis, former inspector, who's now taken on the chair of the new LEAP UK. So we've got some heavy hitters, and I think once the profile of LEAP increases in the UK as we work with other NGOs and advocacy groups, then we will see that more police officers will have the courage to speak out. It's very difficult.
Yeah, these are the people. These are the people we need on board. When Bovey from Devon, a sort of former pill munching sort of shroom head, says change the law, they don't seem to listen. But maybe if we can get people from the establishment, I'm very anti-establishment, as you know, then perhaps there's more chance there of them changing the law.
Well, they have their uses, the establishment. I mean, I've been very intrigued. I've been speaking out against the drug law for years now, and I've been very intrigued to see that some of the other former very senior spies, have now also spoken out. I mean, Dame Eliza Manning-Buller was the head of MI5 a decade ago. She was one of my bosses when I worked there.
Yeah.
And she has said publicly in speeches in the House of Lords, I think it's the House of Lords, she said that the war on drugs has failed and we need to negotiate with negotiate our way out of the problem, just as we negotiated our way out of the problem with terrorism in Northern Ireland. And also the former Deputy Chief of MI6, Nigel Inkster, has also spoken out and said we need a rethink, the war on drugs has failed. And it's not a difficult proposition because we've been there before. We've seen this in the world before, where, for example, in the 1920s, the US had alcohol prohibition, and that led to a huge explosion of organised crime, which then had the rug pulled out from under its feet once prohibition ended in 1933. So we know that prohibition didn't work. We know it failed all the time. So why we are still in a position 100 years on, virtually, thinking that prohibition is going to work this time, I do not know.
Now, when you were working for MI5, was that your view then? Or did
Yes,
you think was that the view of your colleagues, or did you?
Oh, I suppose I had slightly more exposure to the arguments because for one of my jobs when I was working in T-Branch, which was terrorism, I was in charge of investigating terrorist logistics, which of course is the sort of movement of arms and personnel into the UK. So I worked very closely with customs in the UK, all over the country. And, some of them became very good friends, and they were saying, look, we know it's pointless. We know we can't stop the flow of stuff. Even if you get one big haul, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
So even from that point, I knew it failed.
And of course, we now know that people like Bob Ainsworth, who was a drugs minister under Tony Blair, while he was actually minister, he didn't think it was working and believed that the law should be changed. Danny Kushkett, who I think is the head of Transform, I remember him telling me years ago that most cabinet ministers or MPs would privately agree with him, but the second you put a TV camera in front of them, it's back to the same old prohibitionist nonsense.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's been because of the sort of the screaming headlines that politicians tended to get by even dipping a toe in this debate in the tabloid media, they began to see the whole issue as a sort of live third rail they couldn't touch without electrocuting themselves. Yeah. However, the debate has shifted so much over the last few years that it has become something that any thinking person would want to be discussing. Now, interestingly, I found recently an article in The Independent from 2005 where a politician, who was not that well known at that point, said we need to have a rethink about the drug laws. Prohibition is not working. It is causing more harm than good.
Was that Cameron?
It was David Cameron, yes, indeed. So, when he was a contender for the Tory crown and wanted to look like a moderniser, he was very happy to say this.
But now he's saying marijuana is... But now he's saying marijuana is toxic.
Which is a bit rich considering his alleged personal history with drugs, which of course, is of no interest.
Not alleged. He wasn't expelled, was he? But he got into trouble at Eton for smoking weed.
Indeed. I mean, if you think about the roll call of just US and UK leaders over the last decade or so, we've had Bill Clinton, we've had George Bush, David Cameron, we've got George Osborne as the Chancellor at the moment as well. I mean, anyone under 55 nowadays probably will have indulged at some point with something.
Yeah, or at least known people who will have.
Exactly.
But
and
they come up with this nonsense argument now that, but that was back then, it's all changed now, that it's now skunk, as if the cannabis has somehow changed into something that's 20 times stronger, and this is all nonsense. I mean, I'm nearly 40 and I can remember smoking pretty strong stuff more than 20 years ago, so, and I believe people smoked cannabis in the 70s, and when our current MPs were smoking cannabis in the 80s, they were smoking it to get stoned. Same reason people smoke it now.
Of course, and the crazy aspect is that there's so much research to point to the good health benefits, the efficacy of a whole range of different compounds that you find within cannabis, some of which might get you high, some of which won't.
Yeah.
And the only way that these can be prescribed is if the big pharmaceutical companies then extract the actual compound and put it in pills which they sell for huge profit, rather than allowing people just to smoke a bit of weed to alleviate symptoms. And that's just sick, it's corrupt, and you can see why there's so much pressure on our governments and the UN to uphold the drug prohibition, because it upholds the profits of big pharma too.
No, I know many med users, and there's Sativex, which is basically a cannabis tincture with peppermint in it. It's pretty horrible, and they don't really like it. They just want the real stuff.
Well, it sounds like the creme de menthe of the cannabis world.
I've tried it. It's like cannabis and toothpaste.
Oh.
Nice. Totnes Hemp show with Chris Bovey talking to Annie Machon of LEAP Law Enforcement Officers Against Prohibition. Is that right?
Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
Law
You can find us on, there's a very American website in existence. It's just www.leap.cc. They're very careful not to use a US domain name. But we will, as we set up LEAP Europe and LEAP across all the different European countries, have our own website as well.
So, is there any positive news? I mean, I see in the Netherlands they were getting more strict. Although today I read a story that they're ditching the weed past in Haarlem.
Yes, no, I mean, the Netherlands, since 1976, has famously allowed people to consume cannabis in certain coffee shops, which were licensed. Although the trade still remained illegal and meant that the trade was still in the hands of organised crime, it meant that the people who chose to smoke a bit of weed were not being penalised for it. And of course, this also resulted in a wonderful statistic that said per capita, Dutch people smoke half the number of Dutch people smoke weed as in the US, where of course highly illegal and means you get thrown in prison immediately. So that's an interesting statistic in itself. Despite that, the Christian Democrats in the Netherlands a couple of years ago started trying to change the practice because they were worried about drug tourism, where people from Germany and Belgium would cross the border just to buy their stash. So some cities, certainly in the south of the Netherlands, then started saying, well, only locals who are registered with certain coffee shops can smoke weed without penalisation. Now, this is a problem not just for people who might want to go to the Netherlands and smoke a little weed legally, but it's also a problem for the people in the Netherlands who don't necessarily want to be registered as weed smokers, because who knows, it might have come back in their future lives. Popular policy.
Oh, it was doomed for failure from day one. I hear in the areas where they have implemented it, down in the south in Maastricht, that it's caused